and suddenly we've now got a lake, and then the amphitheatre looks down to the lake. Now, the amphitheatre is definitely a Bridgman feature, but the lake and the softening of the lake, I'm sure, is part of Kent trying to loosen the straps. Think of Palladianism as a straitjacket, and Kent is in this straitjacket, and garden design is in this straitjacket, and it's got to be loosened out, and that's what Kent does. So there's the amphitheatre on the right, and there is Kent's temple in the middle of the lake, and of course the cascade, as you can see on the left. The amphitheatre is interesting because I personally think that these amphitheatres that Bridgman was interested in doing were for theatricals and for displaying plants and for sitting in, and I'm sure they derive straight from the Bobley Gardens, because that's the first thing you see when you go to Florence. As with all my students, the first thing we see is the Bobley. And these lovely paintings that were commissioned around about 1750, John Harris, the most lovable rogue in the world, John and I go back a long way, he called this particular artist, who's anonymous, the master of the tumbling chairs. And you can see that almost all of them have got tumbling chairs. Can you see how many chairs there are, though? And that's what these gardens were for. They were meant to be sat in. And then you get the perfection of it all. And this is Kent, Kentissimi, as Walpole would have said. I think Rousham is probably the most perfect and beautiful garden in England, certainly. It's one of my favourites. I remember what I said earlier, go behind things. And the reason you go behind things, not because Venus has a shapely bum, but she does, but you see where she's looking. And you need to see how to see these gardens. And the exciting thing about Rousham, one of the most really exciting things about Rousham, is you can't see it. And the reason you can't see it is because you have to walk it. You have to interact with it. It's incredibly interactive, but you can't see it. The only place you can see some of Rousham is on the other side, along the main road, looking back, and you're never ever meant to see it from there, because you're always meant to be part of the family or the guests that walk through. And my eyes were opened to Rousham by someone who is in the audience, who was my first PhD student, Sue Gordon, over there. She's the expert on Rousham, so I have to be very careful on my metal. He felt the delicious contrast of hill and valley, changing imperceptibly into each other, tasted the beauty of the gentle swell or concave swoop. See what I mean about women? And remarked how loose groves crowned an easy eminence with happy ornament, and while they called in the distant view between their graceful stems, removed and extended the perspective by delusive comparison. It's Walpole again, writing in the 1770s, but published in 1782, History of the Modern Taste in Gardening, really seminal work on garden history. He felt the delicious contrast of hill and valley changing imperceptibly into each other. And that's the Arcadian landscape, contoured. Long before Brown, that awful man, that destroyer of these great landscapes, came and destroyed them all, and long before Repton started doing contouring. Kent does it all before. So, here is Rousham and Venus's Veil. Venus's Veil, women. Why doesn't someone do a book on... I should. I'll do that. Next one. Oh, I can't go on about General Dormer, but General Dormer, bachelor, military man, absolutely dotty on bronzes, as William Kent says in 1738. Although he's crippled by a regular fit of the gout, he is still bronzo mad. And here is the interior of the parlour with one of those Kent ceilings again, the grotesque work, because remember, Kent's good at patterning. And there is this extraordinary house with Gothic wings looking out to a paddock with longhorn cattle who are successors of longhorn cattle that were there in the 1730s, 1738. We know that there were longhorn cattle there. This is how you bring the paddock right to the house, and you do it, of course, by a ha-ha. This is the garden in 1738, and just to show you, there's the bowling green. Oh dear, here is the river, the Serpentine River. Here's the Elm Walk as it then was, and here are lots of wiggly paths, and there is Venus's Vale. And that's the walk to the paddock where there is a castellated barn. Now, can you see? You can't see that garden. You can't. You can only walk it. It's really clever. But remember, again, it's only clever because Bridgman's laid out the framework, and then Kent just loosens the framework. And Kent does this clever thing of when you're on the top terrace and you look out into the landscape, he calls in the country, as Pope says, or brings in the country into the landscape by putting garden buildings in the landscape to make it look as though the whole of your landscape is a garden. General Dormer, the dying man at the time, so the dying gladiator is a very, very apposite thing to put in the garden. And in terms of iconography, Shoemaker's horse attacked by a lion can be read as tamed nature and untamed nature. And of course, Rousham is an epitome of certain areas that are tamed and certain areas that are untamed. But there's a lot more iconography in it, and you need to read Sue's brilliant thesis on this. There is the paddock with the castellated barn, and here is the great Parineste arcade. And typical of Kent, if you know your classical architecture, you have porticos that are 2, 4, 6, 8, who do we appreciate? You never have 3, 5, 7, 9. Kent does. That's 7. 7 arches. He's clever. He's clever. But can you see? It's his mind. It's him. You know it's him because he's playing with you playfully all the time. And then, of course, there's this big thing about General Dormer and his obsession with the Antinous. And I got into terrible heavy water when I did the book on Kent about this. But the best review I had was in The Guardian, and it was by Alan Hollinghurst. He had a brilliant review, absolutely brilliant. He didn't like lots of the book, and he loved lots of the book, but he was very, very interested in the Antinous, who, of course, was Hadrian's male lover, who died in the Nile, suspiciously. And, of course, if you look carefully at the statue, you can see that there are bulrushes behind him. Now, the problem we've got with the 18th century is often the people that leave the records are stewards or gardeners, and they don't understand the iconography of the statues. Sometimes he's called the Colossus, sometimes he's called the Apollo, but there's no doubt in my mind it's the Antinous. And it's General Dormer again, because what are gardens if not reflections of the psyche of the people that create them? How many of you have been round to Highgrove? Yeah, it's Prince Charles, isn't it? It's him, it's his interests, it's his obsessions, it's his personality. And this is an interesting too, we're getting very close now. What's the time, Jeremy?
25 past.
Oh, I'm a little over. These are 2 designs by Kent, would you believe? There is the Worcester Lodge, very, very Palladian at Badminton, 3 miles from the house, one of the greatest of the garden buildings. As you can see, all it is a dining room. All it is. It's one of the most perfect and poetic dining rooms that's ever been done. But on your right is the monument to John Churchill at Blenheim. I mean, you couldn't get something more baroque than that, could you? And that's designed by Kent. The eclectic urge is what Kent's about. And that's what makes him a great man. Now, I just wanted to show you that lovely picture of the rabbits again, and Kent lolling by the obelisk at Chiswick. And I want to give you 2 quotes. The first one is by George Virtue, who, as I said, is a very unreliable source to people of this period. And the last one is the last lines of the book I wrote on Kent. By slow increase of his distemper, suddenly overpowered and tended to a mortification in his bowels and feet, especially inflamed. Attended he was with great care at Burlington House, a fortnight or 3 weeks when he died of a mortification all over on Tuesday, April ye 12th, 1748, his age about 60. Virtue could not even get his age right. Kent was 63 and about 4 months. In a gesture of friendship and respect, which meant more then than it might today, Lord Burlington had his companion buried in the Burlington family vault at Chiswick. There at least was one love that did dare speak its name, because it had nothing to hide and much to celebrate. And there he is. in the portrait by William Aikman, looking terribly self-satisfied. The second Raphael that couldn't even catch a likeness. Thank you. Okay, have you all been... I don't do Facebook. I like to keep my private thoughts to myself. But apparently you will be panned across to if you've got questions. And I will do my best to answer them. And those of you in the audience that really know me, tell me to be quiet.
Do we have any cards that should come forward? Good. Do you want to...
Oh, no, they've got to tell me. I
yes,
need to know who they are.
I'm sorry, you're right.
I need
you
to know
read the
who
cards.
they are.
We're not going to do that. Let's go ahead and read the cards here.
This is Alison Weir, who's about to come on the MA in October, and if it's a good question, she will do really well.
Is it a coincidence that Paynes Hill is so close to Esher Place and Claremont?
No. Good question. Yeah, I mean, all of these people were vying competitively with one another, but in a very amicable way. They were all sharing ideas, they were all sharing the notions of how garden design should be being developed. And of course it's difficult for us to go back to think through what they were doing. I mean, we garden historians try to sort of intellectualize it, but basically what they were doing were modern improvements. That's all they were interested in. Rather like we, you know, suddenly in Chelsea, Piet Oldorf does prairie planting, and you see it all over the place. And that's, in a sense, what was happening. There was no Chelsea at that time to drive fashion, but what drove fashion was people's patronage circles, their connections. And I'm sure that that's what happened. So when Pope talks about that council in 1719 of all the interested people to do with gardens, they would all meet and they would discuss and they would then change their gardens based on those ideas. And Pamela, or Alice, I think mentioned, I think it was Pamela, the Kit Kat Club. You know, it's an age of clubs. So not only did they know each other through the House of Lords, but they knew each other through clubs, and they talked a lot in the coffee houses and swapped ideas. So yes, I'm sure that's the key. And of course we've got Paynes Hill, Esher, and Claremont. Three major gardens of the period. Very, very close. And of course, these Rococo, the word has been used by John Harris particularly, these Rococo, but I like to use the word eclectic gardens of the 1730s and 40s. They're all clustered around the Thames. Again, you know, they are small estates, some of them, and everybody knew everybody else. So we've got Pope at Twickenham, we've got Walpole at Strawberry Hill, we've got Marble Hill.